Hello and welcome to this Project in a Box video session. This is part 5 of our look at the new method manager that comes out with version 5.3. And here we're going to be talking about finishing touches. So finishing touches, but very important touches. This is where we're going to look at report setup and all configuration and permissions models and the like that go with your type of project set up within the method template. So we're going to start at a form we did actually pick up very early on and have a quick look at, which is up here in File and Template Properties. So very important form here, lots going on. We're just going to make that a little bit bigger so we can see all of it. And the first time we came and looked at it, we did look at this General tab. Here we've got the ID of the method and its display name, and when you first copy an existing method it will have the same details here, so the same display name and description. And when you're creating your project in the main system, that can make that a little bit confusing because it'll show up as two identical methods. So it's good to change this name, and it's also good to change the description to reflect the changes that you've made into this particular method, and you can put in here whatever you want to. We can also put some copyright information and version information as well. And then we have this flag here, hide this template in the client. Often when you're iterating your methods, so you had an earlier version of the method and now you have a new version of the method you want to be used for all your new projects. What you might do is download the old version, set this flag, and then re-upload the method. Now the method for the old method needs to still be on your server because you'll still be running projects that use that method. It has to still be there. But if you set that flag, it can't be picked up in the create new project form. So it enables all new projects to be created with your new method and old projects to still run with the old method. Then when you're happy all those projects are finished, you can then remove the method from the server entirely. So that's a very useful flag. This area at the bottom here means when we're creating a new project from our method, it can decide whether we set up a new stage or not. So this is set up to have a new stage added with the project when it's first created, and it will be called Desk Study, and it will be of the type Desk Study from our available stage types. If you don't want to add any stage at all, you leave the name blank, and then it won't create a stage when it creates the project. You can't create multiple stages, just the one, and if you don't create any, then users will be able to add them later on as they wish. So let's work our way through these tabs. Aliases allows us to alias the main sections of documentation in the Explorer. So currently this is called a project, a stage and specialist. They're exactly the same as they were default. But for example, in the Agile methods, we call it a project, we call it perhaps an iteration or a time box or something like that. And the specialist, we might call it something different. We might call it project library, or we might call it, whatever is appropriate for your methodology. The next item here, stage alias flags. When you're updating the stage property information for the project, you can set up a set of tick boxes that users can click, up to 6, and you set up the term here that you want. That's optional, and in fact it's quite a legacy area. Many people are not using it anymore, but we're still supporting it for those customers that do. The colors area here allows you to define the colors that will be used in the Explorer on the Windows application. Again, more and more people using the browser interface, so this is less relevant, but it is still supported, and it allows you to define the right-hand panel of the Explorer, the document panel, the file panel, and the text terms that are going to be used as well. Here we've got stage types, so you always have a default, even if you're not actually using stages. And if you're not using stages, for example our 1 and 3 step methods, which are designed to have all the documentation at the project level, and we don't use stages, we often alias stages here to say not used, so it appears like that in the tree. But there is always at least one stage type which is default. Even if you don't put any documentation in it, it has to be there for the method to be valid. If you want to add extra ones, you simply come down here, give it a new name, and in fact we did this in the earlier session when we talked about stages. You simply give it a new name and press create, and it will then create the XML structure here for you to sync up and put your documentation in. And you can do this at any point through the life cycle of the method. It doesn't just have to be at the beginning. You can come back and add extra stages, and those can be injected into projects that are using this method. Here we have the reports prefix, and this is when we're publishing reports in the main system back into the project documentation structure. So we create a monthly report, we want to save it back into the structure. It will offer you publish locations which start with this in the specialist area. So we have a standard document we put into the specialist area, which if I come and show you here is called reports, and it sits, like I say, in specialist products here, reports. And so any document that starts with reports, so you can have reports, hyphen customer, reports hyphen director, etc. And then those will be offered to you as publish locations. And of course you can change the permissions on those if you want to, so only different people can see them. All of our standard methods have a generic reports document. We don't split those down into different ones and give different permissions, but you can do that if you want to on your methods. So that was the reports publish locations. Then we get into setting up reporting structures. These tabs here, the remaining ones in this form, are for doing that. We have some built into code data structures that Project in a Box supports. The most commonly used one is the finances log, and so here you are telling the system which file is to be used as the source information for that. If there's a file listed, that will be set up in the project once it's created on the server, and that it will find this file from your structure, and it will set up a unique link to that file for that project in the main system when the project is created, and that's where it will go to get the data structures that it expects to come from a finance log. Now that's a pre-configured data structure that's actually managed in here, the spreadsheet names range. It has to be a particular data structure that's expected by the system for reporting, but you can change within that file where it's put. There's also quality log and proposal tracking form. They're of course only used in certain methods, not in all of our methods. But these things, you can't change the structures of the data. It's a locked rigid format, and it feeds through into some locked rigid reporting elements. They're the tick elements at the beginning of the report specification forms. You either include them or you don't include them. Then we come on to the more generic spreadsheet elements, and these allow you to define whatever you want to bring from spreadsheets to be included in your reporting. And again, these will be set up here for the method, and then it will translate that when you create the project using your method in the main system to link to the actual files that are in for that project. You'll see here to find which the particular file is, it needs to know the document name and the file name. So if you change your document names in the tree here, you'll need to come and relink these here because they won't then hook up properly, and in fact you'll get an error message when you try and create your project, or these elements won't appear in your test project. So it's always a good idea when you've finished your method to go and create a test project with it and make sure these things are hooked up properly. Now when we're setting these things up, we've got a number of different choices of the type of data that we bring through here at the bottom. This is the most common one, which is a table. That's bringing back a defined grid of data. The definition of that is included here. This is using a named range which is set up in the spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet has a named range which is a set of cells, and that's what it's going to bring through and put into the reporting. And that's the reference that's going to have for it, benefits list. And many of these will be tables, and you see it's the most common one, so we don't actually have a separate reference for it. This one's also a table here as well. But you can bring other types of things through. So this one is an image. You can see it's shown as an image here in the column, and images set up here. And that's going to bring all the images that it finds within the worksheet export data. So this isn't using a cell range, it's just using a worksheet reference, and that's what these ones here are using as well. And then the third type is attributes, and this is a block of data that's going to feed the properties database in the main system. And it's a much simpler format. It's 2 columns of data coming from the spreadsheet. First column is the property name you want to create. The second column is the value for it. So these are rarely used directly into reporting, which is why they don't have a name reference. But they instead go into the properties database, and then you pull the data out by property name and use that in your reporting. So this is allowing you to standardize the data collection. So rather than just creating the project and then each project manager's got to go and hook up the data sources, you're doing all that here for them, which is a real benefit in terms of standardizing the data you're collecting. It doesn't mean it's standard forever. It can be changed on each particular project once it's created, but this is saving the project manager the steps of having to know what to connect up and to do that connection. Then we get into some more standardized things here. So in the next tab we've got plans, and this allows us to set up the sources of tasks, risks and issues coming from this project data set. So here we've got one file which is feeding the same things, tasks, risks and issues. Of course, on some methods you have a different file for schedule and a different file for risk and issue register, for example, or a different risk register and a different issue register. You can have multiple registers if you want to, so some people use multiple issue types to collect perhaps a daily log and also an issues register. Again, you simply hook those to the file and document name, and again, if the document name has changed, you'll have to come and hook these back up again, and they will then be set up with unique file references when you create the project. Over at the end here we have an approvals form, which allows you to set up the default approval types that you might be running for a project of this type. You can always type in extra ones if you want to in the approval form when you go to approve a file, but this is about prompting for some standard ones. And at the end here we have PBX files. This is about the sources of data that we want to set up from PBX files. So when we're running a method which isn't using Word files, it's using PBX instead, we can bring data out of those and feed them into the main system. And so we will be using often the project mandate as the source of the description for the project, which will then be fed forward and used in other documents and appear in reporting. And so you might here see the file name, it's the same ID, you define the file and the document name, and then every time this file is checked in the main system, it will then look for properties that have been exported from that PBX file. So as you can see, this is a really important form for setting up the structure of the data and the structure of stage management and some of the particular things behind the scenes. As we come further down this form, we can see here extended properties. So we don't generally, these extended project and stage properties are pretty much legacy now and commonly not used, but some customers do still use them. This allows you to set up by method different properties that you want to have collected. These don't though feed into the database property model, so they are just stored locally for the project, and there is a couple of places where you can get them back out into reporting again. Like I say, they've been superseded a bit by or a lot by the properties model, because we now tend to find that people want to standardize these organization-wide, system-wide, not necessarily by type of project. The one that is particularly used, and is used more so now in fact, is process properties though. So we have 2 process properties that we're collecting for each of our processes. These are notes and status. We've got a pick list for status and a general string type of text collection for notes. And those will be collected or available to collect for each of the sub-processes, and they will then collect system level properties in the main system that can be used for reporting. And we've referred to these a few times where we're injecting them back onto the diagrams and where we're including them in reporting. So as we're working our way further down these, we then get to client options. Client options allows us to define the naming structure and the numbering structure that we want to use in a project of this type. So here we're using a number letter model for our file versioning numbering. So files will go 0A, 0B, 0C, 0D, and then you might upgrade it to 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, 1E, 1F, and then you might upgrade it to 2.A. That's the numbering structure. You can change these to be whatever you want to. It can go up to, I think, 6 levels, although nobody really uses that sort of level. And you can use numbers, letters, Roman numerals, upper and lowercase letters, etc. So you define that to match the sort of structure that your organization typically uses. And then at the bottom here we have file naming convention. As I mentioned, we always use project name, a project code if it's available, if one is set up for the project, and a version number in our files when they're viewed or checked out. And we also include the read-only and view model, and here you can see how we construct those elements with brackets and dashes between them. So you can change that if you want to. You can make it very simple so that a viewed and a checked out file looks exactly the same and it's just the file name, for example, business case. We don't recommend that because it's good to have the uniqueness of a differentiating between view and checkout, and it's good to have a project name or some unique identifier in that string as well, because it stops that issue of checking the wrong file back into the wrong project happening. The second tab, Export Properties, this allows you to define the properties that you want to inject from the properties database into your files when you check them out. Now, we will inject things into Word files, Excel files, and PBX files. And you'll see many of these are our standard things like the customer, the description of the project name, the intro, project manager, sponsor, etc., status, project code, and those things can then be used on the surface of the documents or in headers and footers to give quality assurance information. If you want to add any new ones, you simply type the property name in here, and then you can give it an alias if you want, so it looks nicer when it's projected as a blank field into a document. As we come further down, lookup values here. This allows us to set the things like the portfolio and project statuses for the older type of portfolio and project status. The portfolio one is still used. You can define project roles for the roles form, and you can define the other things like document statuses here that we use. Again, tends to have fallen out of usage a little bit. It's a little bit more legacy, but you can set those things up here if you want to. And then as we work our way down, we've got client homepage rules, hub homepage rules, hub sidebar rules. We've looked at those before. And then down at the bottom here, we've got permissions information. So the permissions model for a project in a box runs on a default of 3 standard permissions groups. Well, in fact, 4 standard permissions groups. You've got read, write, and modify, and then you've got no access. If you don't exist in any of these active groups, you automatically appear in no access. And these control whether you can see the project at all. If you're in one of these active groups, you can at least see the project in your project list. If you're in no access, of course, you can't. And then what you can do with the project at a project level, and what you can do with the project's documentation at a per document level. So at the project level, if you can read it, then you can see it. You can open the project and you'll be able to see some of the content. Same for read write. If you've got modify level permissions on the project, then you'll be able to manage the project in terms of changing other users' permissions and changing reporting content and structures, etc., properties, all those sorts of things, depending on your system license. But if you have to have a project license first, and then does your system version license, whether you're a manager or a team member, allow you to access that functionality. So there's a combination effect here. But you firstly must be given that permission on the project. So these are permissions groups that we're setting up. And by default, we will have these so that the document permissions line up against the project permissions. So if you're given access to the read group, you would get the ability to open the project and to see the project documentation, but not to change it. If you're in the read write group, you'd get the ability to see the project and open all the documents that you have permissions for, which by default would be all of them. And you'd be able to then read write within that document, so you would be able to check it out and check it in and add new content, but you wouldn't be able to change other people's permissions or delete things, for example recycle things. If you're in the modify group, of course, you can do all of those things, recycle things, add new content, you can manage the permissions, and you can manage approval processes on content which is within those documents. So that's, as you would understand it, the standard permissions model for Project in a Box, and that's why this is in here for the standard methods. But you can add your own if you want to. So it's quite common for people to add an additional permissions group, for example, which might be called Director, and you might give them a different permission. So by default, the same as the project manager might have, but then you might choose to give them a different list of documents that they see or don't see, and different things that they can access. And so in a similar way, you might have one for supplier as well. Like this, you might have a supplier group, and they would normally get, for example, a read permission on the project and maybe a no access permission on the document. Now what that means is that they will get no permissions to see any new documents that are added, unless that. So if you add a new document to your project, for example correspondence, once the project is created, people in this group will not automatically see it unless they've been given specific permissions to see that document. So it stops things automatically dropping into people's permissions regime. So we can add those extra sorts of groups here. This saves you having to do it on each project when you create the project. So here we're setting up some standardized sort of things. And if you remember when we talked about the permissions groups, or the permissions for which diagram you see here, for example. So here we could have something that says about custom group. So I could say, I'm going to show you this diagram if you match custom group director, for example. So we can give the director a different diagram to the one we give to supplier. Now that means that obviously we can put onto that different navigation elements, different processes, different collections of documents we want them to see, different functionality we want them to access, etc. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't be able to still get those things if they go off and browse through the back of the system. But generally most people don't do that. They use what's presented to them directly on the diagram. So this isn't necessarily a lockout of functionality. Permissions, of course, is a lockout of functionality. So if they've only got a read level, they won't be able to see, for example, the entire project's plan. They will only be able to see tasks assigned to them. So there is a lockout of some of those aspects in functionality. But navigation is quite a significant driver of what people actually use. So that sort of stuff is very important, those setting those permissions groups. And then when it comes to document permissions, of course, as I say, the starting position normally for a project is that people will see the things that line up against the permissions groups. So if you're put into the read group, as we say, you get read permission on everything. If you put into the read write group, you get read write group permission on everything. If you put into director group, well, you're currently getting modify on everything because that's the things we've set up. But we might not want to give the directors access to everything because it sort of clutters up their view to some degree. So we might not want them to see, for example, images, specialist documents. What we want them to see the PID. We want them to see acceptance records and other such things. So there's some things we want them to see and some things we don't want them to see. So we can simply set that up to be what the selection we want, and that will then be defined when you create a new project of this type. That structure is set up for them. They'll see the things or not see the things accordingly. And obviously we can do the same with supplier and take away lots of stuff so they just see a limited set of things that we're interested in. So this is really powerful in terms of if you want to personalize the experience of users within the project, they're going to get the things that you've set up for them there. So that's definitely worth investigating if you're going to be sensitive with documents and audiences. And pre-setting those permissions groups makes it easier for the project managers, even if they're not going to use them straight away. There's already a supplier group set up, so they don't have to go and work out how to do it. They just have to allocate people to the supplier group to restrict their permissions on not seeing things like finance documents. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about here is the validate button. Method templates can be complicated, and the system will do as much as it can to align things for you, but it can't align all of them. And you'll see there's an errors tab here, and in fact we can use validate to go through and check that there's nothing strange. So for example, if we'd in the doc folder removed a file that we needed, that we'd called for here, it would tell us that there was a file missing, or that there was a misalignment between something. For example, you might have changed a diagram name, and then a link in one of the process diagrams somewhere else was pointing to that, and it was incorrectly hooked up. It would tell you those sorts of things in the errors here. So it's always worth doing that validation check here. Validating the stage structures to make sure they're lined up against the project structures, and to validate the method template is as good as it can be before you go and save it and upload it to the server and try it out. That's not a guarantee you're going to get everything, but it's a lot of common things that are picked up for you there, mismatches, misdirections, etc. What you absolutely should do is upload it to the server, create a test project, and go through and make sure it's as you expect it to be, that all the materials are there, and that it's accessible with its own name when you create it, and that it's got the reporting set up that you want, and run some reports and make sure those things all work. Very important to do that. Otherwise, you go away and create 100 projects, people start putting things in and they're not right. That's a lot of effort to recreate and correct all those things. So definitely you should always run test projects at the end. So hopefully you've made it through to the end of these 5 sessions. I mean, we called this one finishing touches, but actually they're very, as you can see, they're very important things in terms of making sure that this is an efficient process for the project managers. And many of these things, like setting up reporting, setting up permissions models, are really, critical to how well these things work for project managers in particular, but project teams also, once you roll these things out. So it's important to finish these things off properly. Good. I hope you found that helpful. Method templates and use of Method Manager is quite a complex area. It really is for super users. This isn't for your casual user of the system. This is for people that know the system really well, use it frequently, own the system often within organizations. If you've got any questions, do ask us. We deal with these method templates all the time, and we can advise you on what works and what doesn't work, and what might work in your particular situation. So don't feel shy, struggling with something. Just give us a ring, drop us an email, ask us, and we'll be glad to help. Okay, thank you very much.